Okay, so welcome to another tutorial, part of the components under introduction to excitable tissues. So in the first part, we did the introduction to excitable tissues. Then we went on, I explained the genesis of the action potential step by step. If you haven't watched those videos, please kindly check on the tutorial Tutor Oscar and watch those videos before you go on with this video. Okay, so synaptic transmission. Now, why are we looking at this topic? Now that we learned about the genesis of an action potential, the action potential has been generated by the neuron, but the action potential need to be transported somewhere because this is carrying signals. Your body is does electrically coordinate itself. But now we are interested in how does this action potential move from one neuron to another or from another neuron to any effector organ. Okay, so I welcome you all to this tutorial. Without wasting much of our time, let's dive into the lesson. Okay, so was just a recap of the previous tutorial on how an action potential is generated from the resting membrane potential here, the resting membrane potential reaches a threshold, depolarization occurs, then overshoot occurs, it reaches the membrane potential equals to 40, then the depolarization starts occurring here, then after polarization, there's hyperpolarization due to slow closure of potassium voltage gated channels, then the membrane potential will be restored to resting state by sodium potassium ATPase. Okay. Now, we need to look, as I mentioned, so this is synaptic transmission. Synaptic transmission, there are actually two terms there. Synaptic, meaning that this transmission actually occurs at a synapse. So what is a synapse? This is just a small gap between two neurons where chemical signals are transmitted from one neuron to another. It's just a gap that is in between two neurons. Okay. Then we actually have types of synapse. We actually have one, the chemical synapse, and the electrical synapse. Now, we should be more interested in looking at the differences between chemical synapse and electrical synapse. And why is it that we have these two? How are they unique from each other? Okay, so the electrical synapse actually has gap junctions and it's usually found in the heart. So when you look at the electrical synapse, as we can see it, later on we'll differentiate it from the chemical synapse. So the electrical synapse actually just have, there is direct connection between the presynaptic cell. Presynaptic cell, this is more like the axon terminals. Then the postsynaptic cell, these are more like dendritic cells, which are receiving the signals. Okay, so the presynaptic cell is directly connected to the postsynaptic cell via the gap junctions. So it's actually indicated here that it is usually found in the heart. So it is found in the heart. Why? Because electrical synapse transports electrical impulse at a very fast rate because there is no delay. There is no electrical delay. Okay. Then we go to the chemical synapse. So for the chemical synapse, the characteristic of chemical synapse actually has the synaptic cleft. Synaptic cleft is just the gap, the junction that is in between the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. So that there is a space in between which causes a delay in these neurons. That's what differentiates it from the electrical one. It's usually slow due to the synaptic delay. Okay, it's not direct connected as in electrical. The major neurotransmitter is acetylcholine, of course, and it has some ion channels. So for the electrical, for the electrical one, it doesn't have any channel. The major way it transmits impulse from one neuron to another is just via the gap junctions. Okay. So when you look at the chemical synapse here, we are able to see the the synaptic cleft here. There is this space. Okay. The synaptic cleft. This synaptic cleft here. This is a this one is a presynaptic neuron, and the other one is a postsynaptic neuron. We want to transmit this impulse or an action potential need to move from here going to the another neuron. But there is a synaptic cleft here which separates them. Okay. So we need to look at the components of synaptic of the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. How do they communicate? Okay, so how do they communicate when actually there is no direct connection between the pre and the post? Okay, so when we look at these vesicles, the synaptic vesicles. In the presynaptic neuron, we have the synaptic vesicles. They contain neurotransmitter molecules. Okay, like glutamate, acetylcholine, all those, or GABA. Okay, then we have these channels here, the voltage-gated calcium channels. Okay, that's the major parts of the presynaptic neuron. Then on the postsynaptic neuron, what do we have? We have the ion receptors. These ion receptors, they are specific to certain neurotransmitters that come here. Okay, so what really happens is, as I displayed when you look at the structure, I want you to imagine the structure of a neuron. A neuron moving from the dendrites, the cell body, the axon terminal, the node of Lambert up to the axon terminals. The presynaptic neuron is the neuron, the nerve end, the axon terminals. Then the postsynaptic one is receiving the signal. So this area around here could be the dendritic cell. So what happens is when an action potential reaches the axon terminal, it reaches the axon terminal. The action potential reaches the axon terminal. What really happens is that it causes the voltage-gated calcium channels to open. Once voltage-gated calcium channels open, calcium start moving inside the cell. Once calcium starts moving inside the cell, we mentioned to say that this at first, whenever there's nothing that is happening, we call that resting membrane potential. Inside, it was at rest. But since calcium is rushing inside it will become depolarized. Okay, because calcium is positive and moving inside, is changing the charge. It's becoming more positive inside. Once depolarization has occurred, the synaptic vessel releases these certain neurotransmitter molecules like acetylcholine, GABA, or glutamate. But what really happens is that the synaptic vessel combine with calcium, then they move towards the axon terminal ends towards the synaptic cleft. Once they reach the synaptic cleft here, as you can see, these are synaptic vesicles moving towards the end here. They're all coming towards the end here. Once they reach this area, they release the content which is inside neurotransmitter, specifically in the contraction of muscle, we have acetylcholine. So once this neurotransmitter is within the synaptic vesicle, once it reaches the end here, by the process of exocytosis, this synaptic vesicle releases the neurotransmitter inside the synaptic cleft. As you can see, these smaller particles, they are actually neurotransmitter molecules. Now, the most important part of a neurotransmitter determines what happens now. Okay. Okay, we have the excitatory ones and the inhibitory one. So excitatory one like acetylcholine, they will further bind to these ion receptors depending on what neurotransmitter bind on the ion channel receptor will determine what will happen next, whether to inhibit the effect or maybe to excite the effect. So once the acetylcholine reaches here, it binds to these ion channels. What happens is that each and every nerve, each and every neuron makes its own action potential. So once it reaches here, another action potential is generated in the postsynaptic neuron until this process goes on and on for like that. It goes on and on until it reaches where it like to the effector muscles for you to feel what's happening in your body. Okay, so that the previous one was just the the synapse, which is between a neuron and a neuron, but we actually have a neuromuscular junction. This is also more like a synapse, but it's neuromuscular junction, meaning that a neuron and a muscle, they are connecting. Okay. It's the same thing that I explained there. It's everything. But what differentiates them is the effect that is going to produce. In the previous one, it was all about transmitting electrical impulse from one neuron to another. But in this one, it's more of producing an effect for you to lift something like skeletal muscle contraction. It's more like producing an effect here. So everything that I mentioned, neuromuscular junction and the synapse, there's no major difference, except that on the postsynaptic cells, they are what we call nicotine ligand gated sodium channels. These sodium channels are the ones which depolarizes they are actually the ones which depolarizes the muscle cell. Okay, so I mentioned to say that each and every neuron produces its own action potential. Same with the muscle cell. They produce their own action potential. All they want is the signal to move from this area to be sent in the synaptic cleft. Then they receive through the channel and produce their own action potential. Okay, so this is all about how the electrical impulse transmit from one nerve to another. All right. So thank you very much for following through. I recommend if you started with watching the video, please don't forget to subscribe and like the video and share. Thank you very much for watching.